Welcome back to another History of the Papacy podcast remastered. I'm Steve, your host. Previously, we talked about the first bishop of Rome, Peter, Prince of the Apostle, holder of the keys of heaven, etc., etc. I thought a next good stopping point on our journey through the history of the popes of Rome would be to look at the ordained clergy of the early church. These would be bishops, priests, and deacons. The early church had many, many more offices than this, but these were the offices that required, quote-unquote, apostolic succession. In this episode, we'll try to discuss the roles and duties of deacons, priests, and bishops in some degree of detail. We'll also look at the idea of apostolic succession and why it is so important to the story of the Roman popes. As we've learned in the previous episodes, the Bishop of Rome is not the only high-level bishop to be called Pope. The head bishop of Alexandria in Egypt was and is called Pope to this day. Actually, even before the popes of Rome were called Pope, the popes of Alexandria were called Pope. But I digress. We also learn that the word Pope is an anglicized form of the Latin Romance language / Greek word Papa. In fact, Papa is what the Pope is called in most other languages today. And we're going to, in this whole podcast episode, in this whole podcast, the History of the Papacy podcast, language is going to be so central, and I will steer you toward a collaboration and interview that I did with Professor James Papa Andrea, where we talk a lot about these issues of a wide-ranging discussion, but a lot about translations. Anyway, now Papa essentially meant something like dad. In the early church, the elders or the leaders of a community started to emerge. There were the 12 apostles, then the 70 disciples who were chosen after that. 7 deacons were ordained. The first deacons were actually ordained before the first priests were ordained. A fun fact, even though priests are of a higher authority today, the priests are acting kind of in the place of bishops. These leaders went out to teach, preach, and lead communities of early Christians, what Gary Stevens would call clubs and others. And they were given titles to reflect their positions, as any organization is wont to do. The word deacon comes from the word diakonos, which came from Greek and which meant servant, and priest comes from a Greek word presbyteros, which meant simply elder in Greek. Bishop derives from the Greek episkopos, which was kind of a household servant position, who was in some circumstances an overseer of a household comparable to, I guess you might say, a head butler. In this position could even be a slave. In the church sense, it was a title that was supposed to impose kind of a sense of humility on the holder and also show that the bishop was the caretaker of that local church. These leaders of the church emerged to organize community, but they derived their power from one of the original apostles. Even now, a priest in most Christian traditions, if they're called a priest, they're called father in English. In other languages and traditions, the priest is called something that denotes leadership or elder status. The leaders of monastic communities receive a title that's often we'll call it an abbot or abba, which means father, originally back to Aramaic. In traditions where the priest can marry, the wife of the priest is often referred to as a female form of elder, such as presbytera. In Russian and Ukrainian traditions, they are called something akin to mother, and it's also that case in just about any other tradition where they have married clergy. The wife is called something like mom or mother. High-ranking nuns receive similar titles as well. As we see, all of the top leadership positions of the church carried very humble titles that were supposed to show leadership, but also community or fellowship. So in the traditions that have apostolic succession, the priests can go back all the way to another priest, a bishop, a bishop, a bishop, a bishop, that goes all the way back to the apostles. And this was This was a method that was used and is used to this day to ensure that the teaching of the apostles and the Jesus was passed down by someone who had the stamp of approval, by someone who had the stamp of approval, etc., all the way back to the beginning. Even if the various churches don't agree with each other's teachings on certain issues or aren't in communion with each other, they still often recognize the apostolic succession of each other. One thing to always keep in mind is that in the early church, these distinctions between Catholic and Protestant and Orthodox, they didn't exist. They had different divisions, but we'll learn more about all these various different divisions as we go along. There were, and like I said, there were certainly differences in teaching and interpretation among the early followers, but the relative modern differences of theology and doctrinal lines would not be drawn for many centuries in the future to come. So in this episode, I want to focus in on the role of the bishop, but I think it is important to give a summary of the other two ordained offices, that of deacon and priest. Nearly every Christian denomination uses one or all of these titles. But, it kind of breaks down into the exact duties of each one that are different, and they're sometimes drastically different. Deacons were and still are helpers at the local level of the parish church. The various duties are in assisting the priest of a parish in liturgical duties, giving the homily or the sermon, doing certain readings and other tasks to help the parish and the parishioners. The sermon or the homily, of course, is the teaching portion of the Mass or the liturgy. The first 7 deacons were ordained during the era of the apostles and were given the responsibility of taking care of widows, the elderly, and distributing charity and alms. Interestingly, the first 7 deacons all had Greek names, and that was probably the fact that they were Greek, obviously, but they were probably not pagan converts to Greeks, but instead were chosen from the leaders of the Hellenistic Jewish community. And we will talk a lot about the Hellenized Jews, so I'm going to kind of skip over them at the moment, but keep them in mind. Basically, they were Jews who spoke Greek and were culturally Greek and less likely to follow the Mosaic law strictly as other Jews. And they existed in the diaspora all over the Roman Empire. And to a certain degree, they were in conflict with the Hellenized Jews and other more traditional, you might say, sects of Judaism at that time. If the first ordained clergy of the earliest church were from this community, it really shows that they were a significant part of the Christian movement. Deacons, of course, at that time were in the apostolic succession, and this office can often be a stepping stone towards becoming a priest or a bishop. In some traditions, especially later on, deacons would train and mentor under a bishop. They would be basically like a bishop's right-hand man, almost like a vice bishop. This position would fast-track them to becoming a bishop right away, sometimes even skipping the office of priesthood altogether. Presbyters, or more commonly priests, are the second ordained office, and the word simply means elder. Priests have obviously existed in many other religions that long precede the use of the terms in the Christian context. We could go into a long history of the role of priests in Druidism, various forms of paganism. In future podcasts, we will spend a lot of time taking a bird's eye view of the religious situation of the Roman Empire and beyond at that time and the role of religion in society. In its most basic terms, a priest leads a local community in the Christian church. The role of priest in Roman Catholicism and other sacramental churches and even some Protestant denominations, they're pretty similar in a lot of ways. In the Presbyterian church, the local community is led by elders, hence Presbyterian. Priests carry on all the duties and responsibilities of deacons, at least in sacramental churches, but they also have a number of other duties as well in their job description. A few of the most important duties of a priest are teaching the Christian faith, hearing of confession, absolving or binding and loosing of sins, as we have learned in previous episodes, along with presiding over the Eucharistic sacrifice. That even comes to one of the more ancient terms for priest president, but that's another story for another day. And now a word from our sponsors. The priest in the priesthood has certain connections to the priesthood of the Jews of the Sanhedrin and the temple. Both carried out the sacrifices and had to meet certain requirements to serve as a priest. Christian priests serve in the place of a bishop when the bishop cannot be at the local location of the liturgy, which has become generally the case. The authority of priests comes directly through the bishop. Basically, the priest is serving in the place of the bishop and in the name of the bishop. Any power that a priest has is subject to the authority of the bishop. A priest should teach what the bishop says to teach, go where the bishop tells him to go, and basically do what the bishop says to do. The Christian church in many ways is very local, but it is also extremely hierarchical as well. The balance of locality and hierarchy has been an area of conflict in the Christian church during its entire history. The level of central versus local control will also be a central theme in the history of the Roman Papacy. So now is a good time to explain and discuss what the Eucharistic sacrifice is and how it applies to bishops. Bishops, as the successor of Jesus' first main followers, or apostles, were entrusted with carrying on the teaching and priestly functions of the early church. A primary priestly function in the new sect was reenacting the Last Supper of Jesus and his apostles. The major change in Christianity from Judaism of that time was the belief that the believers no longer had to sacrifice like animals and such to God at the Jerusalem temple anymore. Judaism has obviously changed and evolved from this time as well. Christians and Christianity's change in doctrine was that Jesus' death was the ultimate and final sacrifice, so those other temple sacrifices were not necessary going forward. And the Last Supper description from the Bible, Jesus breaks bread and shares wine, which represent his body and blood. Bishops have the power to perform that liturgical duty, which recreates this situation. This is the doctrine in the Roman Catholic and other churches who subscribe to this idea as transubstantiation, where the bread and the wine physically and literally and actually turn into the body and blood of Christ. Many Protestants obviously don't subscribe to this notion that the Eucharist has really changed, but it's instead more of a symbolic or spiritual change. But in the Roman Catholic Church, this is a huge part of the bishop's authority. Only priests and bishops can perform this duty, and priests perform it in the place of bishops. During the earliest time, bishops were able to perform this function for all the believers in a community because there weren't that many of them. But as the movement quickly grew, bishops took on a more supervisory role, and the priests began to carry out this duty at the local level. Deacons cannot perform the sacrifice. Bishops' delegation of this power to other elders in the community would begin to build the foundation of the authority and the focus of power into bishops and patriarchs, continuing us onto the path of the power of the popes of Rome. The priest-bishop relationship, in my opinion, is the synthesis of a situation that was going on in Judea and Syria at that time. There was a complicated and at times chaotic mix of factors that was going on religiously and politically. Local Jewish teachers were starting to emerge as a separate institution from the temple priest. This carries on to the modern day. The local teachers in Judaism are the rabbis, which meant teacher or master. After the destruction of the Jerusalem temple, the focus of the Jewish religion turned inward and refocused on the local teacher or rabbi. This wasn't an overnight change by any means. It took many centuries and really didn't happen in a vacuum either. There was a push and a pull between the Christians and the burgeoning rabbinical Judaism. This change in focus would also have affected early Christian communities. Judaism lost its official central point in the temple and had a much more difficult time developing mechanisms to replace the temple, a lot having to do with the policies of the Romans. The role of the Jerusalem temple was not as central to Christianity, and it had the bishop organizational structure to replace it. In fact, the early teachings of the church, even before the destruction of the temple, were to separate the followers of Jesus from temple worship. The Bible is full of verses that show that the central focus of the new worship would not center around the temple. As things would go, the temple would be destroyed by the Romans just a generation later. So this shift in focus in administration and authority, as well as its flexibility, was a reason why the early Christian church was able to spread so quickly throughout the Roman Empire and beyond. The apostolic succession from Jesus to apostles to bishops gave the early bishops legitimacy to teach and spread their message. It also gave the bishops influence and organizational structure to gain converts in the highly competitive religious market that was the Roman Empire in the 1st century CE. Speaking of organizational structures emerging, at this earliest point, one bishop would serve one geographical area, and generally a city or a town. Pretty soon after, a hierarchical structure would start to emerge. Bishops who oversaw other bishops came about next. The modern hierarchical structure was beginning to evolve at this time, but it wouldn't be formally put in place until ecumenical councils and other councils a few hundred years later. In the modern Roman Catholic Church and other churches with an episcopal structure, they follow a similar plan, you might say. There is a local bishop who oversees several parishes in a diocese. The diocese system was used in the Roman Empire. It wasn't used, it was invented in the Roman Empire by Diocletian. In Europe, the modern dioceses used by the church are almost exactly the same as the diocese set up by Diocletian way back in the late 200s, early 300s AD. And really, this diocese system and this whole system set up by Diocletian was very interesting, but we will get into that in future episodes. So the archbishop whose throne is in a large city may be called a metropolitan bishop. Eventually, the bishops of the largest cities in the Roman Empire were given the title of patriarch. Initially, there were patriarchates in Rome, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem. Constantine would make his own town, Constantinople, into a patriarchate too later on. There was an order of precedence to the patriarchs. Rome was given first place in precedence due to Rome's status as the capital of the empire and the throne of St. Peter, and having the double apostolicity of being a place where both Peter and Paul resided. This did not give Rome any sort of absolute supremacy, though, but the Patriarch of Rome would begin to take on more powers and authorities. This is going to be a major theme that will develop. During late antiquity and the Middle Ages, bishops began to take on characteristics of secular leaders, such as thrones, elaborate vestments, crowns, regalia. Church structure and the clerical offices were an important part of the story of the Middle Ages and the Roman Empire and antiquity, and one we will be looking into a lot more as this podcast develops. Now, of course, future episodes will outline the religious situation of the Roman Empire, and particularly the situation for Jews and early Christians in Rome and in the large imperial cities. In the first few years after the time of Jesus, the church was beginning to organize itself. Some of it was directly from the organization of the apostles, but a leadership position was emerging based on the rapidly changing situation of the time. There were many different teachings going on, and leaders would have to step up to debate and solve the pressing issues that were engulfing Christianity. In the next remastered episode, we will look at the first meeting of the apostles and the early church founders to discuss some of the first controversial issues to develop in Christianity. This apostolic council, or the Council of Jerusalem, has always fascinated me, and I really love that topic. And it really does, this council sets the stage for how controversies would be dealt with in later Christianity, the council would develop and evolve into the main problem-solving mechanism for the church for centuries after this very first council of Jerusalem that's actually documented in the canonical New Testament. So I hope you really have enjoyed today's remastered episode on bishops. I'd like to thank all of our patrons on patreon.com/history of the papacy. Go there to find a great way to support the show. If you have any questions, comments, or feedback, I'd love to hear them. Send me a tweet, a Facebook message, or an email to steve@a2zhistorypage.com, and I will talk to you next time.